Have you ever found yourself in a relationship of any sort that was wonderful in some ways, but fundamentally unsustainable, toxic, self-destructive, unworkable, and had to be destroyed? Well, if you have, this book that we're doing for this episode should have something that you'll recognize. It is the Fox Spirit of Bluestone Mountain. Yes, it is our very first Fox Spirit story on this podcast. It only took 74 episodes to get here, but we have got here. The author listed on the front cover is Zhou, but as you'll learn, it's maybe not quite that simple as to where this story comes from what mind. The guest for this episode is the story's translator, Timothy Gouldthorp. I almost said Throp there. Who knows why I'd get Throp and Thorpe mixed up. I guess it's just one of life's mysteries. Anyway, I won't dally anymore with this intro. I'll just take us straight into the TrChFic news, the translated Chinese fiction news. So we got 4 items. The first, actually a couple of these are sort of sequels to previous news things I've covered here or mentioned here in this little news segment. So the first is about an event that I think I was talking about in the last news segment in episode 73. So this was the Chinese Literature Readers Club June installation on Jiang Zolong's Empires of Dust, and you may remember that the host of that session was me. So I was interviewing one of the book's 2 translators, Olivia Milburn, for a solid 40 minutes or so, and then we had questions going to the floor for the end segment of the event. It's a virtual event, and the link in the show notes will take you to the YouTube upload of that event. So you can watch me, you can see Olivia, and you can see I believe the book's editor also makes a bit of a guest appearance. So it's a fun one. It's right now not really got very many views, so get in there, be one of the first people to watch this thing after the fact on YouTube. Now, the next piece of news, this is the return of Bogna Conwar. I think I'm pronouncing that right. She wrote an essay a ways back on the dark forest theory that appears in Liu Cixin's infamous trilogy, Three-Body Problem. Now, she's not put out another essay about it, but that essay has been sprinkled into a virtual exhibition as audio files, I guess. So maybe you'll hear someone, I'm not sure who, but you'll hear someone reading snippets of that essay as you explore a very strange science fictional virtual gallery. I can't really explain what it was like wandering around that virtual space on my laptop screen. I'll just leave it to you. Again, the link is in the show notes if you want to do that. And if you find those Easter eggs, because I actually didn't find them, then let me know via the social media, because I'd be interested to know how exactly they're done. Okay, now the next news item, this is kind of topical. It's Sheng Keyi related, an author who I've not covered on the show, but whose name has appeared. There's a translation of one of her essays has been put up on the publisher, the website of the publisher, McSweeney's. Now, McSweeney's published a book called I Know What's Best For You, which was a collection of essays all about reproductive freedom. So you might see why this is relevant to current news. I think the original edition of that book was all US focused, but they've released a supplement called I Know What's Best For You all over the world. And I think if you order that original version, you get the supplement, the international supplement, for free. And they've put up one of the essays from the international supplement on their website, and it's the Sheng Keyi essay. So it's called The Wombs of China. It's fairly short. I confess I've not read the whole thing, but it's very nicely laid out. It's footnoted, it's dated, and they've named the translator, I think. Yeah, they have named the translator. It's Jane Weijian Pan. So yeah, check that out, I suppose. If you don't know how that's relevant to current news, then perhaps you should watch the news a little bit more. Okay, last news item. It's a competition. Although it's a competition that many of you listeners probably won't be qualified to enter, because it's for 11 to 18-year-olds. It's the Leeds Centre for New Chinese Writings Bai Mei Gui translation competition. It's the 8th one they've run. I'll just read the copy they've put out. That'll save me sort of trying to paraphrase it. I'll be doing that thing where I try to paraphrase it and then my phrasing ends up being longer than and less clear than theirs. So I'll just read their copy. So they say, We are delighted to announce that following the success of our first 2 picture book competitions in 2018 and 2020, our competition this year will again be open exclusively to students in secondary education between 11 and 18 years old, and will once again be run in partnership with the Singapore Book Council and Balestier Press. It's free to enter with a link at the bottom of the page, so if you're learning Chinese at school, this could be a fantastic opportunity. Our text this year is written and illustrated by award-winning Taiwan author and illustrator Zhou Jianxin. The story is set in his hometown of Tainan and addresses themes such as the impermanence of life through a deceptively simple and beautifully illustrated children's fable about a squirrel. The book was showcased at the Bologna Children's Book Fair in Italy in 2017. There is a prize as well. I'll just read their copy about the prize. The author of the winning entry will have the chance to be mentored by award-winning translator Helen Wang, who's awesome, by the way. She's just a hero. And to see their translation published as a picture book in a bilingual edition of the text by Balestier Press. Wow, awesome. The winner will be formally announced in November, and the winning translation will be featured in a special programme at the 2023 Asian Festival of Children's Content. Wow, the AFCC in Singapore. The winning book will be marketed at the festival and to schools and libraries throughout the UK, Singapore, and worldwide. And the judges are Nikki Harmon, Amanda Ruiching Flynn, and Jennifer Feely. I don't know if Amanda's name has come up on the show before, but I believe Jennifer has, and Nikki Harmon definitely has. She's a friend of the pod. So, again, link to this is in the show notes. Remember, if you're over 18 or under 11, then you're not qualified for this one. But if you know a teenager, a little squirt that is an aspiring translator or learning Chinese, or indeed learning English, with Chinese as their first language, then this could be worth a pop entering for them. So pass it on. That's the end of the translated Chinese fiction news. So I'll shut up now, and as a solo speaker, I'll shut up, and then you'll have to listen to me again speaking to our guest. So I'm not really going to shut up, but yeah, enough of this. So on the show, we have Timothy Gouldthorp, translator of our book for this episode, The Fox Spirit of Bluestone Mountain. Very exciting to have you here, Timothy. As I understand it, it's your first time on a podcast.
It is, and I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
You're very welcome. So I'll just throw you in right into the shallow end with the first question for you. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your connection to literature/Chinese literature?
Sure. Well, I was born and grew up in Perth, Western Australia. I've always been interested in reading and in literature, but like so many others growing up in the English-speaking world, it didn't occur to me at first that I might want to learn or might need to learn a foreign language. In my early 20s, however, I did become interested in learning languages, primarily so I could read literature in the original. To begin with, it was European languages. And then after several years with this background, learning European languages, I thought I might like to challenge myself with a more exotic language, a non-European language. Today, we're going to be talking about fox spirits, a very seductive creature. I think learning a foreign language often involves a kind of seduction too. One is seduced by the language and by the culture. Growing up in Perth, I always enjoyed family trips into Chinatown, the strange writing, the pungent aromas of Chinese supermarkets, the wonderful scrolls of misty mountains, the opulence of Cantonese restaurants with the golden tablecloths and the red carpet. While I was at primary school, I was also a great fan of a Japanese production of the Ming Dynasty novel Journey to the West, which I think we'll be talking about a little bit today. It was a wonderfully retro production with magic clouds whizzing about and a beautiful actress playing the role of the priest Tripitaka. However, I think I really have to pin down one thing that really made me decide to learn Chinese, that really seduced me into learning Chinese. I think it would be a trip to the Art Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney, where there was a special exhibition of calligraphy. The controlled power and the elegance of the calligraphy appealed to me greatly. And And I think, like a lot of Westerners before me, I was also fascinated by what I then perceived to be the unique properties of Chinese characters as a vehicle for philosophical and poetic expression. Now, once I really began learning Chinese, I began to find out that many of these ideas about Chinese characters were based on common misconceptions. But nevertheless, there was so much about the Chinese language and Chinese culture that continued to seduce me, that led me on. And eventually that opened up for me the vast treasure house of Chinese literature in the vernacular language and in the literary classical language. And in that treasure house, of course, I found, quite by chance, the little gem we'll be talking about today, a late Qing Fox spirit novel.
That answer you gave had my mind casting back through the show's history. It was just it reminded me of a few specific episodes that we've had. The talk about misconceptions about characters reminded me of a few times, actually, different guests have brought up Ezra Pound and his sort of nonsense,
exactly,
his interesting nonsense sort of ideas about how they work. And you could see how that might, appeal to a Westerner looking for something exciting.
These ideas are very, very pervasive.
I
thought something like I thought that Chinese characters were primarily ideographs, and that was all they were, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mentioning the 80s version of Monkey, that's come up. I forget if that came up on our 50th episode party, where we were doing a few different stories, one of which, or no, it wasn't the party, but it was around, we did a special episode with lots of other guests, and one of them was talking about a chapter of Journey to the West. So Journey to the West came up there, and there was another episode with Julia Lovell and her new sort of fun translation that she did for Penguin. There's one or the other it came up, but the thing we talked about there was that inside China, no one's really heard of that 80s Japanese show. Everyone thinks of I guess it's the other 80s one, the mainland production.
Yes, which is also very popular over there.
Yeah, and I think has a similar retro feel, but the big difference is people watching this story there know what the hell what's going on. But like, I saw one episode of Monkey here in the UK, which must have been the 80s Japanese one that screened on the UK's Channel 4. And it's just like, what the hell is this? So it reminded me of that. And your mention of other languages reminded me of a relatively recent episode with Jenna Tang, who is fluent in a few different kinds of Chinese. She's on the show, so she speaks English as well, but also had under her belt Spanish, and I think either entire or bits and pieces of other European languages. And I think other guests as well we've had on the show have more than just these two languages under their belt. So what other languages do you do apart from Chinese?
Well, I began, funnily enough, with ancient Greek and Latin.
As one does.
Yeah. Well, traditionally in the past one did, but I didn't acquire great proficiency in those languages. Then I went on to learn French, Russian, Dutch, Spanish. What else? German to understand and to read, not so much to speak. A bit of Indonesian. And I'm learning Japanese now.
Holy moly. That was going to be my next question. Were you looking at any of sort of the neighboring languages to China?
Definitely. I think that's what one does. It's sort of a little bit easier to move out into related languages. If one learns French, learning Spanish is low-hanging fruit, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, that's reminded me, again, the show's past, when we had Bruce Humes on to talk about his translation of Last Quarter of the Moon. He's also very interested, I guess, in cultures other than his own, and that's led him from China into Turkey because he's become interested in all the Turkic languages. So I guess you're looking where you might first look for China's sibling languages to maybe like Japanese or Korean, but he's headed through the sort of Turkic route,
Oh, it's fascinating.
Okay, last thing, continuing the thread of like being interested in cultures, like you were describing, the way you were describing it, using the word seduction, that might, I don't know, perhaps that feels a little weird to talk about it in that way. But conversely, think about the language we use to talk about having a strong interest in other cultures. We say, if you're interested in, English or British culture, it's Anglophile. If you're like French culture, you're a Francophile. And then I'm sure just about every listener has heard the word sinophile before. So maybe there's something to that.
Good point. Definitely,
yeah.
it's not just an interest; it's a real love for the culture and the language. And I think without that, it's very hard to learn a difficult language if you're an English speaker, and you really want to learn Chinese to the level where you can read the literature. It requires, I think, some degree of love or seduction.
Yeah, at the very least, you got to care. As the word seduction maybe implies, love can get weird, as we're going to learn in the fox spirit of Bluestone Mountain. So let's get into that. What would you say is the basic premise of the story?
Okay, so perhaps we can begin with our foxy protagonist, Jade Fox. Now, she is a Huli Jing, which means fox spirit in Chinese. In Chinese folklore, fox spirits are foxes that after many years, sometimes 50, sometimes 100, acquire magical capabilities, and in particular, the ability to shapeshift, to transform themselves. In the case of fox spirits, they tend to transform themselves into beautiful women. There are examples of male fox spirits, but typically they're females. These fox spirits are said to have 9 tails, and they're often depicted as being extremely raunchy, as being extremely licentious, seducing men, and in some accounts harming them by stealing their vigor or their seminal essence. So Jade Fox is one such fox spirit. She lives in a remote cave on Bluestone Mountain, and one day catches sight of and decides to seduce the young Master Zhou. Young Master Zhou is a handsome young man, and he's studying for the all-important imperial examination. After the death of his father, he's living with a loyal servant. Jade Fox transforms herself into a ravishingly beautiful young girl and pretends very improbably that she's an ordinary human girl from a good family living a few kilometres away from the young master's household. Now, Jade Fox is actually almost 10,000 years of age. So we have to keep this in mind. There's a bit of an age gap between the two lovers. She's much more experienced, and I don't think the young master stands much of a chance. She visits the young master in his study, where they do things like drink tea, discuss poetry, and get up to a lot more besides. At first, the loyal servant thinks the master has shut himself up in the study to study diligently for the imperial examination. But gradually it becomes apparent that the young master is looking more and more haggard. It's obvious that he's fallen ill. And it also comes to light that he's been receiving nocturnal visits from a beautiful young woman, which is very suspicious.
So all listeners, if you walk in on your partner and your partner seems awfully haggard, ask if he or she has been drinking tea and discussing poetry. And if he or she is evasive, then it's time to be on your guard.
Definitely, especially if they've been shutting themselves up somewhere all night and sleeping all day.
Yeah, and if you find ginger hairs in the room, it's probably a fox or a ginger.
But you've really got to worry if you find out that a little boy in your neighbourhood has gone missing,
murdered,
and has been devoured.
Yes.
Yeah, if a pile of bones and a bloody pool is all that remains, because that's what happened, and that was really the final trigger for the loyal servant. When this happened, he really knew that some kind of a monster or a fox spirit was troubling the young master.
I think it's worth saying here that thus far in the story, Jade Fox seems a little bit malicious, but not entirely bad. She's not just out to be evil for evil's sake. She has some relatable motivations of I want to have fun with this young man. But then the moment someone questions her, this little boy tries to call her out. She's like, well, I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill this nasty little brat. She turns into a fox. And then literally the book doesn't turn the camera away. It describes how in fox form she rips him to shreds. It's quite a whoa, what just happened moment in the text, I thought anyway.
And it's actually quite out of keeping, not only for Jade Fox, but for fox spirits in general. They're ambiguous creatures. They can harm people through these liaisons, but they don't tend to, they're not predatory monsters. So even for Jade Fox, this is a bit out of keeping. But anyway, having found out that the young master is being troubled by a monster or by a fox spirit, the loyal servant seeks out the assistance of a famous Taoist priest who lives nearby. And unfortunately, this Taoist priest turns out to be a charlatan. He's a comic character, a likable rogue. And he receives a humiliating... Well, we can talk about this later. It depends. He's a rogue. He's a charlatan, but I don't think he's a nasty character.
No, not evil with a big E.
He's not evil. In some ways, he's likable. I suppose it depends on your taste. But he's certainly a charlatan and very boastful, and a drunkard. So he receives a humiliating beating, and he comes back with all of his Taoist friends, his colleagues, and they think together perhaps they can deal with the fox spirit, but no, they're humiliated, and their Taoist paraphernalia is desecrated by Jade Fox and her foxy spirits. And with things rapidly deteriorating, the great immortal Lu Dongbing, is forced to intervene. He descends from heaven, and at first he decides to discuss things with Jade Fox. But Jade Fox is very arrogant. She's very haughty, and she even insults the great immortal, accusing him of being a womanizer and a bit of a drunkard. Now, I don't want to give the whole story away, but a huge battle ensues in which Jade Fox and her ragtag army of fox spirits and other creatures are pitted against the forces of heaven. Does the young master survive? Does Jade Fox win the battle? I guess people will have to read the book to find out.
Right. Okay. So I'll try and rein it in on spoilers for the last act. Okay. Now, the book also comes packaged with an intro, which lays out some of the origins of the text, which are pretty interesting, because the cover of the book, we've got the author's name, Zhou Tao, but I think, at least technically, we're not 100% certain that Zhou Tao wrote the book. Is that right?
That's correct. Good point. The novel was first published in 1888 under the nom de plume, 作乐山人, which means moon-drunk hermit. The identity, as you mentioned, the identity of the author hasn't been determined with certainty, but it's very likely to be Zhou Tao. Zhou Tao was born in Jiangsu province in 1850, and he died in Shanghai in 1931. He worked as an educator, at one point as the principal of a girls' school, and also as a newspaper editor. Zhou Tao wrote other novels and collections of stories featuring romantic liaisons and supernatural themes. Whoever the author was, presumably Zhou Tao, the author clearly draws inspiration from a number of other works in the Chinese canon, such as Journey to the West, which makes sense if it was Zhou Tao, because Zhou Tao was clearly someone very much immersed in the Chinese literary tradition. He wrote, for instance, an index to Chinese vernacular novels. And I mentioned, by the way, that the novel is written in the vernacular language, which is closer to the spoken language as opposed to classical Chinese.
Interesting.
I think it was T.S. Eliot who once said that immature poets imitate while mature poets steal. And I think that's what Zhou Tao, whoever the author is, does with this novel in a good way. He develops a very basic plot into a book-length story while drawing on other works like Journey to the West or The Investiture of the Gods for inspiration, but creating in the end something which I think is very unique and very entertaining in its mix of comedy and action and romance.
And is it fair to say that this is essentially an adaptation from the stage to the page? This has its roots in theatre.
Oh, excellent point. Yes, because there is a pre-existing basic narrative which is found, for instance, in a Kunming opera called Inviting the Master to Slay the Demon. And as in our novel, this narrative involves a nine-tailed fox, a loyal servant, a young man by the name of Zhou, and also the immortal Lu Dongbing. So definitely the author of our novel has taken, I think, this very basic plot and developed it a lot, drawing on many works in the tradition and produced something new.
Right. Again, I'm going to reach back into this show's history to the very first episode, which was about Lu Xun, partly about his story, Diary of a Madman, but also about the era he was writing in, which has popped up a few times on the show. So the sort of early 20th century, when I think, at least in the academic world, the big Chinese, the big names in Chinese lit that pop up are May 4th, progressive, lefty writers who were doing a few different things, one of which was trying to bring about this shift from writing in classical to vernacular. But I don't know about the others actually, but certainly Lu Xun probably would have hated this story because he wanted a switch to realism, seriousness, and a turn away from fantasy and romance. And this is totally a fantasy romance book. But then on the other hand, like you said, it's written in the vernacular, which is a choice, I guess. It's a way to popularize the literature to ordinary people. But also the fact that he was headmaster at a girls' school and that he ended up in Shanghai is interesting in itself, because I guess schools segregated into male and female might not seem very progressive now, but at that time in China, I think just having girls in school is a progressive move as far as I'm aware.
Definitely. I believe it was a French school. He was actually teaching in a French school.
Right. Okay. Right. Fair enough. Yeah, I didn't really have any deep point to make there. Just thought I'd give some context for anyone who tuned into episode 1 and then skipped right up to this one.
But definitely, as opposed to Lu Xun, it's a marvelously apolitical book, isn't it? I think it's an entertaining, moving story. There's no political message in the book.
There's no message, but we could analyze it.
I think there's a general moral message, an encouragement towards benevolence and compassion, but certainly no political message in the way that many modern Chinese novels contain a very clear political message.
Yeah, if we have a left right-wing spectrum, we're not going to be able to put Jade Fox on it.
Not at all.
No,
it's very much within the classical tradition of dynastic China.
Yeah. Okay. Although I do challenge listeners to do that. If they want to read the book and drop all the characters in the political compass, then I'd love to see that. Right. I think we've gone through all the basics. I guess we can talk about why the book's fun, what makes it entertaining, what makes it a page turner, despite being so old. I did, in some parts more than others, but definitely there were parts of the story where I was excited to know what would happen next, or I thought it was an entertaining scene, or it made me chuckle, or it got me thinking about what exactly is going on in the characters' heads. Because a thing I did notice is there's a reasonable amount of interiority. We get told what the characters are thinking occasionally, and it's a bit more, well, like for example, in anything else from this period I've read, I can't think of a moment where the character said, and then so-and-so thought this and wasn't sure and had an internal debate and then finally took an action. Like, that was more modern than I expected. I realize I've immediately derailed. I was trying to move us forward and I've derailed us into another side question, but what did you think about that when the characters sort of have debates with themselves, or we are privy to their thoughts?
I think that's an excellent point. And I do think it's actually as you mentioned, quite unusual in the traditional Chinese tradition. And I certainly can't think of anything quite like it, featuring a fox spirit. Now, on the one hand, you have much longer vernacular novels like Journey to the West, but they tend to be more episodic. They don't have such a tightly knit plot. And then you have much shorter collections of supernatural happenings like Liao Jai, Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio, or the Shadow Book of Ji Yun. But in these short accounts, we can't really go behind the scenes into the interiority of the characters, as you mentioned, not only because the account is relatively short, but also, I think, because these accounts, at least purportedly, are being presented as real events. So we can only see them from the human perspective. We don't tend to go behind the scenes and see what the fox spirit is thinking. But as for the entertaining quality of the novel, that's actually why I decided to translate this novel. I thought it was quite apart from the wealth of references to traditional Chinese culture and folklore that might be interesting to a Western audience. I thought that the story itself would or might be entertaining to contemporary readers outside of China. Now, I don't think all literary fiction involves an exciting and well-structured plot with characters with whom one can relate. But I certainly think most popular fiction does, and most popular movies. And I think this novel has something of the type plot and interesting characters of a well-crafted movie script. We have three threads which are interwoven. We have, first of all, the start, the first thread with a young master and his loyal servants. And then we have Jade Fox doing her thing on her remote mountain cave. And then there's the third thread, which is the comic wine-guzzling, meat-eating Taoist priest who has had the good fortune to become the disciple of Lu Dongbing after Lu Dongbing visits him incognito as an impoverished priest. And I think to bring the discussion back to the different perspectives, the interiority, I think that's used quite well as a vehicle for comedy in the novel. We know, for instance, that the Taoist priest is in fact a buffoon, merely pretending to have magical powers. But the loyal servant really thinks he is a powerful master.
Yeah, it takes quite a while for his skepticism to kick in.
That's right. Well, he's renowned locally. You know, he doesn't know that he's a fraud. And we, of course, know that Jade Fox is a powerful fox spirit, almost 10,000 years old. But the poor young master has no idea. Even though, by the way, I think really alarm bells should start ringing. The fox calls herself Miss Hu. Hu is a common surname in China. Hu Jintao, the former president of China, for instance. But of course, it's also a homonym for fox. So in short, I think the novel is very entertaining. It contains all the key elements that make for an entertaining story, an exciting plot, colourful characters, a combination of romance, action, and comedy. And finally, without wanting to give the end of the story away, I think it's in the end quite a moving story. There's an appealing vein of compassion to be found in the story, at least for me, which is in contrast to the cruelty and the very harsh sense of justice that one so often finds in fairy tales.
What you were saying about it having a little bit of everything, I think is very true. Like if you think of the most mainstream movie, at least, because I guess movies have replaced novels as the popular entertainment of the time since the early 20th century, like a Marvel film, they literally do have, a little bit of action, a little bit of comedy. I suppose they don't tend to have anything very sexy. They're very asexual movies, but I don't know, maybe if you think more of like a 90s or turn of the millennium cheesy action film, they would have all three of those things. That does feel like a very populist sort of technique, but it didn't grate on me very much. Like there were some comedy scenes that genuinely did kind of make me smirk, like where the useless Taoist is trying to go after the fox. But of course, anytime he sees her, even if she's in the form of a completely harmless young woman, you can tell he's bricking it and he starts making excuses. I'm sure as well there's maybe a scene where, perhaps I've mixed this up in my head, where he goes down one corridor and he sees again a harmless young woman, but he knows it's a demon, is terrified, looks around another corridor, and of course it's one of her fellow allies in exactly the same sort of guise. So you have this, kind of very cartoon-like image of a guy running around, seeing a pretty young woman around every corner and losing his mind. I don't know, I just find that very funny. But then conversely, I won't spoil how it ends, but there is some quite sincere emotions, some feeling between a couple of the characters. And it's like, wow, this is a very different story from the one I was reading 50 pages ago, and yet it does work. And on a completely unrelated note, but again, a thing that makes this, I think, still somewhat accessible is it's not very long. Like you said, it's not a short story, but it's also not an almost unreadable book like Journey to the West or Dream of Red Chambers, where it's going to take you Well, unless you're unemployed, it's going to take you months to read properly, unless you've got an abridged version. So yeah, like I was able to read this. I read about half of it on one sunny weekend afternoon in my garden, and I think that was the perfect sort of setting for reading this book.
Maybe a mountaintop near a cemetery might have been even better.
But in the sunshine with a nice drink in my hand.
Safe, far away from any potential fox spirits.
Yeah. If there are any in Cheshire, then I'm yet to find them. So you mentioned earlier that Jade Fox is our protagonist, but maybe is that up for debate? Do you think could she be called the antagonist? Who are we supposed to be cheering on? Should we be cheering on old hoary head, the manservant, who is the guy essentially the guy leading the charge and trying to stop Jade Fox? Should we be identifying with the young scholar? Because of course you always identify with the young intelligent man in a story. Should we identify with the various competent and incompetent forces of justice who are there to stop Jade Fox? Like, do you think it is easy to pin down who we should be cheering on and what we want the outcome to be, who we want to win?
Well, that's a good question. And I think this is a book in which we sympathise to some extent, at least, with all of the protagonists. And we therefore desire an outcome where at least none of the characters are, or for me at least, this is just my personal reading, we desire an outcome where none of the characters are destroyed or humiliated without any possibility at all of future redemption. Although once war breaks out between Heaven and Jade Fox, it's not easy to see how such an outcome remains possible. Now, let's start with the easy one, the young master and his loyal servant. Now, I think it's quite easy to sympathise with both of them. The young master is a nice young man whose only fault is to have foolishly fallen for the wiles of Jade Fox. But remember, she's almost 10,000 years old, so he doesn't really stand a chance against an experienced and powerful fox spirit.
It's a real Edward and Bella situation.
That's right. We certainly don't want to see the poor young master waste away and die. And as for old hoary head, his loyal servant, he's a sterling example of Confucian loyalty and wisdom. I don't think we want to see his selfless, tireless efforts to save the young master and thereby save the household, because he's the only son in the household. We don't want to see all of that come to nothing. So I think that's pretty clear. A bit more ambiguous is the Taoist priest. Yes, he's a charlatan, and yes, he makes all kinds of ridiculous boasts. And we might be amused to see him get taken down a peg or two by Jade Fox as punishment for all of that hot air and boasting. But for me, at least, I still want to have held open for him the possibility of him eventually redeeming himself as a Taoist priest. I don't think he's an evil character.
Yeah.
That brings us, of course, to Jade Fox, and I think she is the really ambiguous character in the novel. And I think ambiguity is one of the characteristic traits, not only of Jade Fox, but of fox spirits in general. As we've already discussed, Jade Fox displays at times quite evil behaviour. She's aware that the young master is gradually falling ill and is on death's door because of her, but she's quite callously indifferent to his fate. She, of course, also viciously devours a little boy. So this is downright evil behaviour. But nevertheless, in spite of her callousness, in spite of her violence against the young boy, I think she does remain an engaging and an attractive figure. In a way, as a fox spirit, I think it can be said that she seduces not only the young master, but to some extent she also seduces the readership. We're seduced into sympathising with her in spite of her bad behaviour. Yes, it's clear that she needs to learn a lesson. She needs to be taught to refrain from harming people in future. And yet, I think we don't want to see her destroyed.
So I pretty much agree with everything you said there. And it just occurs to me now, if as a reader, you don't end up hating or judging Jade Fox, then for you as that reader, there's not really a bad guy. There are a lot of characters who need to get brought down a peg and do. So for example, Jade Fox turns a blind eye to a lot of the wrong things she does and is very quick to anger. but is also smart, kind of witty, likes to have fun. So like you said, she's kind of a seductive character in the sense that it's quite easy to be won over to feeling sympathetic for her. And the young master, you have a guy who's a bit lazy, a bit uncritical, but is a good lad. In the rogue Taoist, we have a guy who's a bit of a scumbag, but he's essentially harmless. And then later in some of the forces of justice that come in, I guess they think that, I won't spoil who they are, but they think that it's going to be a cakewalk, but they learn that actually Jade Fox is able to give them a run for their money. And that might sound a little bit like a story from another famous Chinese novel that we already mentioned, Journey to the West, where the Monkey King takes on, well, it's like a bad game of Grand Theft Auto, basically. He picks a fight with the police and it escalates all the way up to the armies of heaven. And he becomes the guy using all the cheat codes, launching his rockets at the proverbial helicopters. He's taking on all the power of heaven and gives them a run for their money and eventually loses, which is not that different from Jade Fox's trajectory. It's just everything escalates rather quickly, given that the novel's quite short. And I thought about that as I was reading, and I thought she's not a million miles different from him. She's, like you said, she's kind of slippery. She transforms into a lot of different shapes. She's very quick to anger, just like Sun Wukong, just a kind of very reactive personality. And I guess is not great at saying no to her impulses, because she really wants to romance the young master, and she just decides to do it. Doesn't maybe stop and think exactly like your average human might, despite being all too human at the same time. So I just wanted to ask, like, as you were translating the book or coming back to it now or whenever, did you find yourself thinking of Monkey King?
Definitely. And I definitely think the author, presumably Zhou Tao, is drawing inspiration from Journey to the West and the Monkey King. And also, I think, in particular, with the battle scenes, the Ming novel, The Investiture of the Gods by Xu Zhonglin, Feng Shanbang. But I think the Monkey King, Sun Wukong and Jade Fox, have a number of similarities. They're both outsiders. They're not quite gods, and they're not human. They're both rather lawless, and they're not limited by any kind of a hierarchy. I think it's interesting. Fox spirits don't tend normally to have parents, and the Monkey King, of course, was born from a stone egg. Both Sun Wukong and Jade Fox have pretensions of being immortals, or in the case of the monkey, a great king, a great sage, equal of heaven. And they're both extremely sensitive to perceived slights because of their animal origins.
Right.
Jade Fox is extremely sensitive to any mention of her furriness. And it's interesting that in both cases, attempts are made by heaven to subsume them within a celestial hierarchy. In Jade Fox's case, Lu Dongbing tries to reason with her. And in the case of Sun Wukong, the gods get together and they come up with a plan. They try and placate the Monkey King by offering him a lowly official position, caring for the heavenly steeds on the island of the immortals, Penglai. But in both cases, the two characters refuse to accept a subservient position, and they rebel. Jade Fox makes war against the forces of heaven, and Sun Wukong runs amok in the heavenly palace, Da Nao Tiangong. And one other interesting comic point in common is that their preferred means of transportation is cloudmobile. They both fly around on clouds.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say, the bargain they're offered is a little different. The Monkey King one sort of boils down to, put the gun down, we'll give you a banana, we'll give you a job. And with Jade Fox, it's, if I'm remembering right, it's, look, you've literally studied for millennia, cultivating yourself with Taoist magic. So why on earth are you screwing around with young men? Why are you picking fights? Look, come on, put that training. We would hate it if we had to kill you and essentially delete all of that cultivation that you've accumulated, that you've built up, almost like someone filling up their bank account. just thought it was an interesting sort of reason to not want. So like it kind of follows that no matter how many evil things she did, the fact that she had a few thousand years of cultivation in the bank meant that there was reason to spare her life. It's just an interesting sort of thing. I can't think of any equivalent of that sort of rationale from like anything from Europe, be it Greek mythology or things from like medieval Beowulf or something. It's interesting logic. Did I have anything else to say there? I don't think I did. Yeah, just just the Monkey King comparisons were interesting.
And I think you made a very good point there. It's interesting that the idea of sparing Jade Fox because of her almost 10,000 years of esoteric training, that's the perspective of Lu Dongbing, the great immortal, who himself was according to tradition, a human during the Tang Dynasty. And he himself, through cultivation, acquired immortality and magical powers. And I think Lu Dongbing's perspective is quite different from the heavenly forces, the King of Heaven, for instance, who represents a much more rigid view of justice, insisting that crimes are punished and that offenders, that an example is made of offenders. But Lu Dongbing's perspective is quite different. He's a lot more sympathetic to Jade Fox and her efforts. And he doesn't, interestingly enough, he doesn't rebuke her for what he sees as minor breaches of conventional morality. He seems to realize that foxes will be foxes. Her tendency to licentious behavior can be overlooked. And nor does he seem to seek revenge against Jade Fox because she was so insulting to him or because she desecrated the tower's paraphernalia. What he does rebuke her for is killing the young boy and harming the young master. And I think these are very, very basic moral principles that anyone, human or fox spirit, might be expected to live up to. Not draining people of their life essences and not eating people.
Yeah, listeners, don't do either of those things, please. It's not nice, and you'll go to jail.
Or at least Lu Dongbing will come and remonstrate with you.
Yeah, exactly. And that would just be awkward for everyone involved. I realize I jumped a little bit ahead of myself there doing the comparative analysis. I'm going to rewind us back to good old morality. So there is a line in your translation, and I guess in the original Chinese, where someone says something, I think I'm paraphrasing slightly, but they say, look, there is a distinction between good and evil. And you forgot about that. And I thought that was kind of well put, because a lot of the time, like I said, it doesn't feel like anyone is going out of their way to do anything malicious, apart from when Jade Fox eats the boy. That was done in anger and it wasn't right. But a lot of the time, her problem, I think, is more that she's amoral. So when the forces of heaven come down at the end and say, look, actually, God damn it, good and evil are real things. And you need to be reminded of that. I thought that was interesting. But do you think it's so simple? Do you think there is a good and evil in the story?
I actually do. I think there is a very basic moral position being presented, and that's the one represented by Lu Dongbing. I think there is a moral perspective being offered, and that's that Jade Fox, although she's acquired power through her alchemical studies, she's yet to acquire wisdom. She's yet to acquire the ability to show sympathy for other people. That's, I think, the lesson she needs to learn before she can become a true fox immortal.
Yeah, it's ironic that she's so old, but is still kind of juvenile in that sense. It's maybe a reason, I think that might be a reason why her bond with the young master, to me, rang very true. They both feel like they're like 21 years old, despite her actually being 21,000 or something. Yeah, so the on the point of her trying or failing to sort of elevate herself, aspire upwards, a lot of things in the story reminded me of a book I'd read not long before, which you've already mentioned, the Shadow Book of Ji Yun, where I think it was in I can't remember if it was in Ji Yun's own commentaries on some of the spooky tales he was relating, or whether it was the translator's commentary. I think it was both. But there was a point made that, look, in Chinese mythology, or if you are adopting sort of Ji Yun's point of view, in the world, all things aspire to like a higher form and will basically get there over time. So if a broom, for example, I guess that a broom is a good one because that will work in the Chinese context, but we might also be thinking of the Magician's Apprentice. If a broom is left along long enough, it will develop a spirit and will eventually become a human, which is secretly a broom. And perhaps give it long enough and it will become an immortal. Give it longer still and it will ascend up to heaven and join the gods. And, despite having, spent some years in China and then spent just as many years now after the fact reading a lot of the fiction and non-fiction in translation, reading books, wasting time online, I'd never encountered that idea before because I guess I am a little bit more biased to the modern stuff. So I just wanted to say, like, before you started translating the book, had those sorts of ideas about cultivation and spirits been on your radar at all?
They had, but in the Chinese tradition,
Right.
You're right. The Chinese tradition is very different from the Western tradition. To begin with, I think it's quite interesting that in the Chinese tradition, the heavens mirror in many ways the mortal realm. And there's no absolute glass ceiling sealing off the gods from humans and from other creatures.
Right, because in Journey to the West, they go to Thunderclap Mountain, which is the Buddha's base, which is just a real mountain in India.
That's right. But they can move free. Immortals can move freely between heaven and earth. And as we've mentioned, in the case of Lu Dongbing, an ordinary human can become an immortal. A fox spirit through cultivation can become a fox goddess or an immortal. Lu Dongbing was even once said to have taken on an evil willow tree spirit as a disciple. So even a willow tree can, if it's diligent enough and if it's given long enough, train itself and acquire eventually the status of an immortal.
And no matter how evil you are, you can always be won back over, away from the dark side.
There's always that possibility. That's right, the possibility of aspiring upwards. But the heavenly realm, to begin with, I think, is quite similar in the Chinese tradition to the human realm. In particular, it's quite bureaucratic. I always was amused to find in the first story in Liao Jie, Strange Tales from a Chinese Pavilion, that a man dies and finds himself in the afterlife in an examination hall of all places, where he's taking an examination to become a tutelary deity, the god in charge of a city. So in heaven, as is on earth, as is on earth in dynastic China. And likewise, when Lu Dongbing wants to summon Jade Fox to appear before him, he writes a formal summons and calls upon the local earth god as a kind of celestial postman.
When I first learned that in the Chinese cosmology, the afterlife is a hell, and it's definitely hell because it has banknotes and a bureaucracy. So as a living person, you have death and taxes. And then as a dead person, you're probably still going to have to deal with taxes. Just damn, that's awful.
Well, that's right. There's money. And if there's money, well, it's reasonable to presume that there are taxes and other financial institutions.
There will at least be someone screwing you.
The distinction isn't absolute, not only between heaven and the mortal realm, but also between humans and creatures like foxes. As you mentioned, fox spirits in many ways are quite similar to humans. They're not like, for instance, they're not like the famous hopping zombies, the Jiangshi. They're able to speak. They're able to interact with humans, and that's why they're so attracted to humans, I think. And yet they're very ambiguous creatures. They don't necessarily abide by human morality. And female fox spirits in particular are unrestrained in a way that human women in ancient China could never have been. There's no patriarchal figure looking over them. And that's what makes them, I think, a potentially disruptive, potentially dangerous entity.
And I would guess at the time this story came out, and like probably even more so in the past, you might hear a plane going overhead. That must have been part of the appeal of the fantasy of the novel is that you get to see a very liberated woman, but then you get the thing you so often get in fantastical stories where you're given the sort of temporary break from convention. You get to see the radical new future where you have a woman who can do what she wants, but then the story has its cake and eats it by bringing her back into line. So you get people who hate it will be happy at the end, and people who are hoping for a maybe more radical future at least get a glimpse of it in the story. And I think you can probably see that in a lot of different fiction throughout the ages. There was a question I wanted to ask about nature. So I had this written down, but I veered away, as I so often do, but I'll bring it back to this question. So we have mankind, we have the humans of the story, and we've established the fact that the heavens are not behind a big glass barrier, that the two are quite permeable. But there's a sort of a third world in this story, and that's nature and animals. Because like we were saying, just like an animal, Jade Fox is reactive and potentially quite dangerous, just like the Monkey King. But also just like the Monkey King, she has a mountain base and she's surrounded by lots of other animals of her own species. She has all her little fox pals, although like you were saying, she doesn't have a hierarchy. So Monkey King is king of the monkeys, but she just seems to be sort of a associate with her fellow foxes. But anyway, getting back to the point, when things escalate, she raises an army, and she does have her fox spirit sisters with her, but that's not what the entire army is made of. It's something I found this pretty funny. She has like little rabbits showing up with swords and stuff. She has all the creatures of the forest showing up to help her. And you have, for me, it was funny. I don't know if it was intended to be funny, but there are wolves and what have you, but there are also little cute animals, but who are in ferocious mode. And it's an interesting thing, like in all religions, whether nature is something that acts in line with the will of heaven or the gods, or whether nature is Satan's church, whether nature is this evil thing that you've got to aspire away from to become more divine. So like, I don't know, do you have any thoughts about what nature is in the story?
I think it's an interesting point that, of course, not only are fox spirits, but all kinds of animals can acquire magical capabilities in the Chinese tradition. Yes, actually, rabbit spirits are quite common. There are tales of rabbits that can transform themselves into human form, for instance. I think this idea of nature is very important in the Taoist tradition. Attempts are made in some way to harness the way, or harness the essence of nature, and by harnessing it in the correct way, one can achieve immortality or godlike status. And that brings us to the question of what it is that Jade Fox is actually doing with her alchemical preparations. More than one Chinese emperor has in fact poisoned himself in the attempt to achieve immortality. Qin Shi Huang was one, Yongzheng of the Ming Dynasty is thought to be another. These emperors and others consumed alchemical potions, which often contained magical, harmful substances like mercury or arsenic. And the attempt here is to harness vital elements of nature that will allow one to achieve immortality and power.
These days, my day job, I work for a pharmaceutical magazine, or mag for the pharma industry. And a thing that it can be easy to forget in medicine, but which is ultimately the case, is that most medicines these days are made from molecules, and ultimately those molecules have come from nature. I'm embarrassing myself here. Maybe some are synthesized these days, but the basics of medicine, i.e., keeping yourself healthy, prolonging your life, it all comes from nature, and it can be from things hidden in nature, very strange little molecules and things tucked away. Or it could be much more simple traditional practices of taking a herb, this or that herb, and making yourself a little bit holistically more healthy. It's not completely drawn from fantasy, that sort of idea, using nature to extend your life.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, although don't do it with mercury. Again, listeners, you won't go to jail, but you will go insane, I think. Okay, so there was another novel I wanted to compare this one to. So in the Fox Spirit of Bluestone Mountain, we have a fragile young man who's visited in the night by a stranger, and his life is slowly drained away until some boring old authorities get involved and put a stop to things in an epic battle against evil. So I kind of just described Dracula, except it's gender flipped. It's a woman draining the essences of a man. I don't know. Did that spring to your mind at all as you were translating it?
I think there are definitely similarities there. A somewhat seductive but very dangerous nocturnal creature has implied sexual relations with the victim. I think it's quite similar. Although I'm not sure in the Dracula tradition, I'm not sure in the case of vampires, sometimes, I'm not sure, is it sometimes the case that one becomes a vampire oneself after receiving a bite, or does one perish because to...
In Dracula, the character Lucy does get transformed, and then our heroes have to kill her. And then he goes for the other woman, Mina, who is on the way to transforming before they finally kill him, and she gets to survive as a nice normal human. So I guess she's a bit more like the young master because he survives as well. But obviously the young master is never in danger of turning into a fox spirit and living on the mountain with Jade Fox.
Well, that wouldn't be so bad, but that's then a difference with vampires, because it's clear that the young master's health has been imperiled, not because he's slept with Jade Fox once or 10 times, but because he's engaged in excessive sexual activity every night for months on end. There's a lack of moderation there, and moderation, of course, being a very important Confucian virtue.
Yeah.
So that's the problem with fox spirits. They lead to obsession and addiction and excess.
We're told he's losing his yang, like his male energy, the yang opposite of the female yin. But you're right, it does feel just sort of like an arbitrary sort of code for, he's wasting his life away, and he's become bedbound because he's prioritized in quotes, the wrong things he should be studying. So the yang thing is there, but the themes feel like the themes and the ideas are handled quite well there, because I think they feel like the real reason he's wasting away, which connects to, I guess, the more conservative part of the morality of the whole story. That's about as far as I think I can take the genius, I'm sure no one ever thought of it before, vampire comparison. So I'll move us on to our next section, the miscellaneous questions. Actually, no, before I do that, I realized I did not come up with any questions about challenges you had translating the novel. So I'll do that now. What was it like working on this novel? Did you have any tricky translation puzzles yet to figure out?
It was great fun. I think one of the challenges was translating the poetry. And I had great fun with the people at Camphor Press, trying to translate the poetry in a way that conveyed the original, but also had rhyme and meter in translation. Which is always fun and a bit difficult.
I've opened up the book to find one, and often these poems come at the start of chapters. So we have like just the chapters. The first paragraph will just be 3 words. A poem goes, and then you get a little four-line poem. So I'll just read this one. The spirit fox's sorcery is broad. To lofty heights the immortal's magic sails. No evildoers rarely flee their fate, and then say who is vanquished, who prevails. So still rhymes, and it's got the right sort of tone, I guess. So was it hard? Or was it just a fun but not too mind-breaking challenge?
Oh, it was fun. I think to translate something, like learning a language, it's similar. An element of interest or seduction or love is very important. And it was particularly interesting for me to look up some of the more obscure elements of Chinese folklore. In the novel, there are a number of quite obscure references to Chinese folklore that I wasn't previously familiar with.
So you mentioned Camphor Press, and again, reaching back to this show's history, I'll just point to listeners, we've covered one of Camphor Press's books publications before, and that was The Flock of Bahui and Other Stories, which was some web fiction that was written by a Chinese author to be sort of like Chinese style Lovecraft stories. So again, like horror and weird stuff and monsters. So not much to say there other than I appreciate that Camphor Press is doing some interesting, unusual books that you might not see from other publishers. And although being sort of Taiwan focused publication house, these two books are from the mainland, and I guess the other one is from the internet technically, so not from anywhere, but they're from mainland authors. So yeah, just shout out to Camphor Press, an interesting publisher. Yeah, so now I'll properly take us on to the miscellaneous questions. First one is, could you suggest a Chinese word of the day for this story that sort of captures its essence?
Yes, the Chinese word of the day that is linked to this book for me would be yuan or yuánfèn, which means something like karmic affinity or karmic connection. The title of the fox spirit of Bluestone Mountain in Chinese is actually a Huli Yuan Quan Zhuan, which literally means a complete account of a fox affinity. Young Master has a karmic connection with Jade Fox, whereby their meeting is predestined. Now, the term yuánfèn, although it originates in Buddhism, is in fact used quite widely in everyday Chinese. It's often used in relation to romance and marriage. In meeting a partner, one often needs to rely on yuánfèn. But this concept of yuánfèn can be used much more broadly. For instance, it's a kind of yuánfèn that you have invited me to appear on your show today. And it's a kind of yuánfèn that your listeners are listening to this podcast now. So I think that's a nice word, an interesting word with deep origins in Chinese Buddhism, but it's also a word that's used in everyday Chinese.
Yuánfèn. I will try to remember that one. Pardon me. Okay. Oh, just going to wait for that plane to go overhead. Can you hear that?
I can a little bit.
Yeah, it's the flight path from Manchester Airport. And there's a train line right by the house as well. So opening the window is always a bit of a gamble. All right. Next miscellaneous question. This is probably an even harder one. If you could pair a piece of music with this story, perhaps the soundtrack for the film adaptation, what would you go for?
Okay, now especially for the battle scene, I choose Megitsune by the Japanese heavy metal girl band Baby Metal. Not sure if you're familiar with them. Yeah. Because kitsune means fox in Japanese, and Megitsune means female fox. And of course, the fox spirit tradition also exists in Japan, not only China. And the Baby Metal band members are said to be devotees of the fox god. Actually, even to this day, here in Taiwan, certain people who are involved in the entertainment industry worship fox spirits. We've talked about fox spirits being a seductive quality. So if you work in the entertainment industry, if you're a singer or an actress, something like that, you can see why you might want to acquire some of that foxiness.
I did not expect Baby Metal. Wonderful. I'll use this opportunity actually to relate a fox spirit story that an adult student, a guy, his English name was William, told to me when I was working in Shanghai. I forget exactly. I think there was it was a conversation class. It was one-on-one tutoring. And the question was something like, do you believe in anything supernatural at all? Like, could be your religion, could be aliens. And I just told him like the one or two ghost stories that I know that happened to me or to a friend. And he said, yeah, I do have a similar story myself. So I'm from Dongbei, the far northeast. I'm from Hale. I think he was from Jilin. I think it was Jilin is where he's from. And he was like maybe early 40 something. So when he was young, China was quite a different place, especially in the far northeast. And he was given, I forget if it was a job or he was on a work trip or something, but he was in this kind of unfamiliar new room. I don't know if it was in a house or a hotel, quite a small room with a window. And in a frame at the wall that his bed was facing, there was a painting of a fox. And he associated foxes with fox spirits and unpleasant things. So I think he turned that portrait to face that painting of the fox to face the wall, so that he didn't have to look at it and be freaked out by it. And then in the morning when he woke up, his bed had flipped around. So his head was no longer at the other wall. And I think he's like, oh, the fox is trying to tell me something. So he flipped the painting back around and he wasn't troubled again. I think he may have also said he felt like something was watching him as he was trying to get to sleep.
That's a great story.
I like it. Yeah, it doesn't, and it's nice and clean as well. It doesn't have anything raunchy. I don't think it was a jade fox.
And it does show that the fox spirit tradition isn't merely something consigned to history. Many people do continue to have superstitions involving fox spirits, or they do worship fox spirits.
Yeah, and when he told me the story, I think at the time I didn't really know so much about fox spirits or sort of Pusongling style stories. I associated foxes more with the sort of timeless figure of the trickster, like the fox, the wolf, the jackal. And I guess you do kind of see that in fox spirits. They're maybe not classic tricksters, but they do have that tricksterish element in that they're not ambiguous. They're ambiguous as to whether they're good or evil. They can transform. They're a bit slippery. They could help you or harm you. Yeah, William told. I'm pretty sure William told me that he said in the part of China I'm from, or at least in my county or whatever, there's a particular strong belief in this or that fox spirit or fox god. So yeah, I think at the time I wasn't quite aware that there was a wider tradition of the Huli Jing, and I thought, oh, is this some kind of like an older folk tradition where you have nature, an animal being the god rather than like Confucius or Lao Tzu or something? And I thought, wow, that just makes it all the more arcane and spooky. But yeah, I'm waffling on a bit, so I'll tell you the musical pairing I picked for this one, and it's literally just an album it's from an album I started listening to last week or something, and I want an excuse to put some of it on the show. But I think the lyrics for this song I've picked are actually weirdly appropriate for the relationship between Jade Fox and the Young Master. So I'll be mega lame. I'll just read some of the lyrics in a very flat voice. So he says the vocalist Dave Palumbo from Head Automatica, who's amazing and sings these lines much better than I can speak them. He says, "Your body is a weapon and you're afraid it could get out. A friend of the devil and you're afraid it could get out." And I thought that felt like a pretty good description of Jade Fox, because whether it's as a seducer or as a child-eating animal, her body is a weapon, and she doesn't like it when people talk about it. That's another thing that pisses her off, is being accused of something she's done. She just won't tolerate being called out. And also, like he said, being publicly accused of being an animal when she's in disguise, that is a trigger for her. That's the kill switch that will get you at least clawed slightly. So there's that, and then it keeps going. She says, Dave Palumbo in his lyrics says, "Don't say I don't cut when I do, I do, I do. Don't say I'm lying when I'm true, I'm true, I'm true. Don't say we're healing when it's just not what we do." That I felt that said something too, because again, it's like, stop contradicting me, stop telling me I'm lying, but then don't say we're healing. So when it's just not what we do. So there's this relationship she has with the young master that at times is kind of a sincere, meaningful, is not the right word, sincere, heartfelt relationship where they both get something out of it, but ultimately it's going to be fatal for the young master. It's a toxic relationship, and it's not sustainable, and it has to end. It's not possible for her to heal it, despite it being powerful in their lives. So yeah, that's the song I picked. Maybe it was a silly choice, but again, I just wanted to crowbar in some head automatica for the listeners.
That's great. I think it really speaks to the deceptive nature of foxes, of fox spirits, and also to their dangerous sexual attractiveness.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, the next question. This is one I'll be snipping out for the Patreon feed for subscribers to that. It's a lighthearted question, maybe. So it goes like this: a fox spirit comes and knocks on your door. What do you do? Okay.
Well, the first thing that I'd say, I'd want to ask is,
okay, I will close that one off. A nice short and sweet bonus question. Now we're going on to the last sort of section. If our listeners would like more like the fox spirit of Bluestone Mountain, where would you direct them?
One I'd mention would be Liao Jai by Paul Song-ling, Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio. I've heard of the John Minford translation is very good. Now, Liao Jai is the classic Chinese collection of stories about the supernatural, and it contains a great many stories about fox spirits. So that would really be the classic text to go to if you want to find out more about the fox spirit tradition in China. The other book is another translation of mine, forthcoming with Camphor Press, which is also a Qing Dynasty fox spirit novel called Hu Yao Yan Shi, or Erotic Tales of the Fox Spirit. And as the name suggests, it's a much more explicit work, rather pornographic, in fact.
Oh no!
And it was on a list of banned books during the Qing Dynasty. It features depraved fox spirit girls and also depraved rabbit spirit boys. But interestingly enough, there's also a very pure, very chaste fox goddess. So that speaks to the two poles of the fox spirit concept, the raunchy lower grade fox, and then finally you have the immortal fox who is very pure and chaste. And interesting enough, this pure fox has a father. She does have a father, which both Monkey in Journey to the West and Jade Fox don't.
Yeah. So I guess on one hand, maybe a little bit more, less of an existential crisis about her origins, but on the other hand, maybe she's got some daddy issues. And really, who doesn't?
She's got a daddy who will probably object to her running away every night to have wild sex in a study with some random scholar.
Yeah, that's responsible parenting. It's funny you mention rabbit spirit boys. So I don't know why this showed up in my feed. Maybe because it's Pride Month, actually. But I recently learned through, I think, in SubChina's Instagram account about what rabbits mean for the Sinophone LGBT world. And I did a Google dive, which consisted of like reading some headlines and some taglines of some articles, and then not reading the article because I had to go head off to work. But essentially, I learned that I think Fujian, and then by transmission, Taiwan. In Fujian and Taiwan, by transmission, there's this again a sort of local rabbit deity which has become a bit of an icon for gay men, basically. And that if I remember right, that's because in that rabbit god's story, like he's a man with a male lover or something. And there was I guess I did do more than sort of skim the article, because it mentioned that although gay love stories weren't the mainstream or anything like that in pre-modern China, they weren't treated as the same sort of censorship that arrives in like the 20th century. I think it was, for whatever reason, modern, maybe because of Western influences, modernizers tried to banish that sort of culture, but it has resurfaced in a similar but slightly different form in modern queer culture. So yeah, I'd be interested to read a rabbit spirit story and see how it reads versus a novel like The Fox Spirit of Bluestone Mountain.
And that's interesting that you mentioned the connection with rabbits, because yes, rabbits in ancient China were associated with male homosexuality, and in this book, these rabbits are always they're gay.
There you go. Yeah, I used to on my WeChat name, I had a little bunny next to my name. I had Angus, and then a rabbit, and it was mostly because I got myself a pet rabbit my first year in China, but then just as a conversation starter, I'd say, you know what, I worked out what my spirit animal is. My spirit animal is a rabbit. Little did I know. But maybe that's why I was so popular at that time. I don't know. I'll end that thread of the conversation and mention like where I might direct readers. I'd probably just point to two books I already mentioned. Great little works of translated Chinese fiction, and both relatively recent. One is Julia Lovell's new translation of Journey to the West, because it's a bit like your translation of this book. It did make me laugh quite a few times. Her translation is genuinely quite funny, and it's also mercifully short relative to like the full non-abridged text, which I don't know. I'm not against big books, but I don't really care much for the almost 90s style TV show format of some of the Chinese classics, the long episodic structure. I prefer something that's a bit more manageable to read like in little eveningly nuggets. So there's that. And then the other I'm going to point listeners to is the Shadow Book of Ji Yun, translated by Yi Iziyu and John Branscombe, who've got a really interesting thing going on where they're trying to sort of tease out the weird in Chinese lit, and also bring in, I think in there, they've got another book which pairs those weird stories of like the Zhiguai with glitch literature, sort of like stories that posit the world as a matrix that we see the glitches in. And that is just so up my alley. That's like someone took an idea I had in my dream and then made it their whole career. So I can't not point listeners to that. So that's all for me with further reading. And now the very last question, what are you reading just now?
One Chinese book that I reread very recently was Fu Shang Liu Ji by Shen Fu, and it's available in English translation under the title Six Records of a Floating Life. It was written almost 2 centuries ago in a beautifully limpid classical Chinese style, and it records Fu's life and his reminiscences. In particular, it records a lot of domestic events that are not normally dealt with in traditional Chinese texts. For instance, he remembers the games he played as a young boy, pretending a toad was a monster intruding on his kingdom. His kingdom was a tiny patch of the garden near the wall, and he spanked the toad and exiled it. Or he trapped mosquitoes behind a net and sprayed water, pretending that the mosquitoes were wild geese soaring through drifting clouds. And in particular, his memories of his beloved wife, who fell ill and passed away at a young age, are incredibly poignant. He mentions, for instance, that she was very pretty, but had slightly protruding incisor teeth. And I think it's specific details like that taken from life that set the book apart and make it so poignant.
You've given me yet another opportunity to reach back to the show's history. I think I mentioned this one recently, actually, but I had an episode on Radish by Mo Yan, which I loved because it's all from the perspective of a boy, or it follows a boy, and it captures all those sort of strange interactions you have with the world as a kid, where like your fantasies, well, on one hand, you have fantasies that blur with the reality without much of a barrier, but also your sort of apparatus for processing the world hasn't sort of fully formed. So there's a sort of a strange fuzziness to everything that I think goes away later in life. And any book that can capture that, what it's like to be a kid, I think is amazing, because it is almost like it's like an alien perspective that is hard to imagine as an adult, and yet we all lived through it. So like, I don't think I ever captured a toad and spanked it as a kid, but like that kind of play, it's amazing that people were writing about that, you know. Oh, I'm going to close my window. Someone's hammering. Right. Yeah, so I'd heard about that book before, but now I'm even more sold. Right. So the book I am reading just now is AI 2041. It's again back to one of my favorites, Chinese sci-fi. So that's co-written by Kai-Fu Lee, who is not a sci-fi writer. He's an AI and tech expert. And the other co-writer is Chen Fan, who is a sci-fi writer. And I guess some listeners might already know the premise of this book, but basically there are each chapter has a story by Qiu Fan, where he takes a piece of technology, AI technology, likely to exist by 2041. The number they actually give is an 80% chance of it being a reality. He creates a drama around it, and then Kai-Fu does a sort of analysis and commentary on the strengths, like the benefits that tech could confer, but then also obviously the downsides and the problems, because if you're writing a story, you need to have some problems. And the impression, I'm only one story in so far, but the impression I'm getting is that being a business guy working in AI, Kai-Fu Lee is never going to say, screw AI. He's always going to put a spin on it. But that's countered quite nicely by Qiu Fan, who is trying to write interesting stories and trying to be honest about some of the weird, awful, and also wonderful things AI could do. So yeah, that's the book I'm reading just now. Just a couple of days ago, I finished And Yet by a collection of Christopher Hitchens' last writings, which, if I was trying to think of something about as opposite from the fox spirit of Bluestone Mountain as I could, that might be it. There's nothing I can really say about that that's relevant to this podcast. So yeah, that's what I'm reading. Nothing else from me here. Tim, is there anything at all we've not hit on that you're dying to say?
No, I think that was a very thoroughgoing treatment of fox spirit.
Yeah, and I'd love to at some point to have you back on to talk about your next book, if it's not going to horrify all of my listeners, but that could be fun.
Depends on their taste.
Yeah, I think it might. So I'll just say thanks very much for coming on, Tim. It was a fun book to read, and unsurprisingly, it was fun to talk about, and it read very nicely. So I think that's down to you and your translation. So yeah, I recommend listeners check this one out.
Oh, thanks very much. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
No problem at all. All right, we're getting near the end now. So one final great big thank you to Tim. Listeners, if you heard anything that he said or that I said that you'd like to respond to, either telling us that we're geniuses or correcting us slightly or just sharing your own thoughts in response, then please do get in touch. You can best way for you to do that, I would say, is through social media. We have a special Discord just for the pod. The link to that is in the show notes, but also we have a couple social media platforms. So there's an Instagram account that is dedicated to the show. That's at TrChFic, TrChFic. I run that. And then I also run my own Twitter account, which is not just for the pod, but mostly for the pod. And you can find me there at Angus Likes Words. If you'd like to support the show, probably the best place to do that is Patreon, because you'll get something in return. You'll get the bonus episodes that I put out. I try to keep a steady stream going. Some are just very short bonus answers from these episodes, but I do record like my own thoughts that can range from like 15 minutes to 45 minutes. Often it's on a book I'll be doing in a later episode. The link for that is in the show notes, but if you just want to slam it into your browser right now, it's patreon.com/TrChFic. There's also other ways to support the show. You can find those on the support page on the podcast homepage upon Podbean. Of course, the best way you can support the show is not financial, it's by spreading the word. So tell your teacher, tell your head servant, tell your local fake Taoist priest, and tell the fox and or rabbit spirit that is coming to visit you at some unspecified time. So that is well and truly the end of the episode now, which leaves only one thing for me to say. 再见.